What is up, you beautiful people? Welcome back to Politically Homeless. This will be the last time that you hear me say, welcome back to Politically Homeless. Things are changing. Things are changing for me. Things are changing for the show. And I wanted to break a lot of that down for you guys today. I apologize to everybody in the Patreon because they've kind of heard me talk through this, as I trust them more than anyone to help me kind of suss this out and reform what the show will be doing in the future. But we're going to be moving the show title and kind of the focus of the show back to Connor Wanders, what it was at the very beginning when I started doing this kind of solo show at the very beginning of COVID times, once COVID killed my business. So for those of you who don't know, before COVID happened, I had worked in personal development for several years. It was really fun. I really enjoyed it. And I loved coaching people. It was great. It wasn't it's like I never was in anything I did, whether it be coaching fitness or coaching little league or coaching individuals and kind of personal development stuff. I never was like the stereotypical, like shove crystals up your ass, like think positive thoughts type of coach. I've always been, and you may have known that maybe why you're here. I've always been a very objective person. I used to call it, I have like a gift of objectivity. I don't really, very few ideas do I get really attached to. It's not really my thing. I don't find a lot of value in it. And over the last several years, I've really started to understand more and more about myself. My life has changed substantially. So during that time, one thing that I really worked on people with was how to show up in a way that was more productive for them, right? And how to show up in their lives in a way that was more productive for them. And a lot of that relied on the feedback of human communication, human interaction. And then along comes COVID and just ends human interaction as we know it for a few years, a couple of years at least. And through that 3 years, I felt like during the COVID times, what I was doing actually offered a lot of value. One of the most common things I heard from people during COVID was, you make me feel not crazy, because make no mistake, we were all being gaslit on a very large scale. And I had a principled stance against the way that was being done, the level of manipulation, the level of exploitation, again, the gaslighting. It was just so much, the blatant lies, and it was so much for me to handle. And I carried a lot of resentment into that, because my life as somebody who is kind of thrives on connection and human interaction was impacted in a big way. I mean, my mental health was kind of put to shit. Like, it was bad. I'd moved to Denver with my wife or girlfriend at the time, and didn't really have any friends. And then 2 months later, get the COVID thing. And then I am, for a year, like somebody who is extremely extroverted and loves being around people, just was not, and it was not good for me. But I found the podcast as a way to like maybe vent some frustration and also try and do it in a productive way, because I had been politically engaged quietly for years. So as that kind of moved on, and one thing that I've learned, I mean, thinking about the last 3 years, I've gotten married. I have a kid now. My daughter is the best. Being a dad is my favorite thing I've ever done, ever. I'm actually pretty good at it, apparently. So that feels nice. And I've changed a lot. And when I kind of took some time off for paternity leave, that ended up being, it's been about 2 months now that I haven't done a show publicly, and just been putting out stuff from the Patreon and Instagram, and actually purged my Instagram of anything that had to do with COVID or Trump or Ukraine or any of these things that I felt like were getting my content suppressed. As I reflected on where I was at, I realized that, one, just kind of wading through the muck and the darkness that is politics was not good for me, right? As somebody who really cares about showing up in your life as the best version of yourself and helping others do the same, and thrives in that, like, I wasn't doing that for myself. And nothing made that more clear to me than when my daughter was born. When Robbie was born, I was like, I'm gonna let myself get all wound up and bound up over shit that I can do nothing about. And there's really not much that we can do aside from use it to create some kind of grift on the right or the left, which is abundantly common and really a great way to have some financial success in this industry. Or just bitch about things constantly and spin yourself in circles. I call it like pissing into the wind. It's like, what's the real point here? Are we going to make those changes? And over some time and some reflection and some journaling and kind of getting back to myself, I started to figure out what I had taken away from the past few years and how I could apply that going forward. And what it really came down to was I'm not taking on big tech, right? I'm not going to sit down with Mark Zuckerberg and talk to him about content moderation. That's not going to happen. I'm not going to sit down with Zelensky and Putin and broker a peace deal, right? And there are great people out there that are covering these things. Taibbi, Russell Brand, like there's people that are doing a great job, people that I look up to and respect. And when things are substantial, they will be covered on this show, but they'll be covered through the lens of what we can do about it in our own lives. Maybe give you a brief rundown just so you can know what you need to care about and what you don't. That's something I feel like I'm pretty talented in doing, is kind of figuring out what actually matters and applying that and communicating that in an effective way. But outside of that, I really want to redefine and refocus a show on what we can do as individuals in our own lives and our own families and our own communities to make some kind of change. You know, if we can, as 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 people, right, make some small shifts in our own lives, you know, inspire other people, motivate other people, make an example for other people, especially our kids and our families and our communities, that's something, right? That's something. Bitching about content moderation, which is financially and just like mentally hammered me over the past few years, isn't going to do anything, right? Bitching and moaning about endless wars and funneling billions of dollars to Ukraine for God knows what isn't going to change anything, right? But what I can do is take that time that I'm investing into all of those things, redistribute that in a way that is more productive for me, and then try and provide you something that's more productive for you. But as I looked back on the past few years and thought about what we were doing here, I found that one thing that talking about politics constantly helped me see in myself was the importance of principles. And if you listen to this show often, you've heard me talk about taking a principled stance. And it's something that I've seen in myself. And I used to talk a lot before I made the shift into politics. I talked a lot about values. And while I do think values are incredibly important, I think that underneath that, we have our foundational principles. And I want to talk a little bit about what the principles of this show are going forward and give you an idea of what to expect. And we are still going to talk about cultural and political things. You know, we may have a little bit more fun with it, you know what I mean? And try and get some laughs out of the craziness and do what we can. You know, at the end of the day, I hope that we can kind of leverage the madness we live in for our own kind of personal development, you know, and like in our own lives, be like, how can I use this cultural reflection in my own reality and kind of do something productive with it? And if we can't do that, then maybe I don't need to give a, you know, maybe that's just not where I need to spend my time. That's what I've noticed. And maybe I've heard that from a lot of other people as well. Some feedback from other folks, especially in the Patreon, that are like, yeah, I just can't even really be engaged with this anymore. I'm exhausted. But there was a time during all of this stuff and the riots and January 6th and COVID and all this, like where we got kind of addicted to this and we got put on the defensive and we got put in these like emotionally heightened states all the time. And I think finally over the past 6 months, maybe a year, it's been kind of like a down regulation and getting back into ourselves and into our own lives. And I feel like there's an opportunity for us to do something bigger here and better here and more productive here. And that's what I want to do. So as far as the structure of the show, it may be similar to what it is now. It'll kind of evolve and grow as we start doing this and finding where the productive friction is in this whole thing. There will be more conversations and that will all be on this feed. So if you're familiar with Andrew Huberman's podcast, how he has his solo shows and then he has the interviews and they're all kind of mixed in depending on what he's doing at the time. That's what I want to be doing as well. There'll be interviews, but it'll all be based on these principles, right? And I want to go through those with you guys and kind of talk them through. And this doesn't mean that these need to be your principles. These are my principles in my own life, something that I've kind of dug into. But I do think that understanding your principles is important. And I hope that through mine, I can help you maybe see yours and we can have this kind of back and forth and discuss them and where values kind of line up and where action kind of lines up within these principles. So I like the idea of three principles. It's kind of good to that's a good round number, add some diversity into your life as far as ideology goes and the way that you line yourself up. So let's just go through those really quick. The first one that really stands out to me. And this has been a principle since the beginning. I remember when the first time I did like value determination stuff back when I was working at CrossFit Central in Austin. Great place, by the way. We went through some of this stuff and I realized like how important curiosity was to me, right? And I don't think I had ever really put that as this like foundational principle. I'd always thought of it as a value and kind of a personality trait. But really, if I look back at my life, and I've lived long enough now, I'm 36 years old, and I look at where I've grown and where I've kind of thrived and what the continuous patterns are in my life, I'm just a curious person, right? To a fault, probably. I'm always like, you know that guys are like, oh, shiny thing, squirrel. It's like we have that kind of temperament. But for me, I've always been really interested, and I think it's because it's a response to the lack of experience and lack of kind of context that I gained in my early life, growing up in a small town, being religious in the kind of mainstream idea and offering of what we get here in the United States generally as far as religion, like Texas Baptist type of thing, which is pretty restrictive and has value, of course, and those kind of things. But for me, didn't really fit me. As I look at curiosity, like after getting out of that, and especially once I got to Texas State, when I moved, that was my third year of college. I transferred twice. I played football my first year. Second year, just kind of like tried to push through, and I was injured, and it was a hard time for me. And then it ended up at Texas State, and started just like having a good time, having the real college experience for a first time, and growing up a little bit, and just kind of starting to see through. And it challenged a lot of people even then. That's kind of when I started to really challenge convention on a large scale. And oddly enough, that was in my fraternity. Like I caused a lot of friction in my fraternity just by challenging things. And I enjoyed the shit out of that. But as I grew up older, I got into CrossFit, and there's so many different modalities in that program. So it was like, it just was a breeding ground for like me being curious about gymnastics and weightlifting and different styles of teaching these things and how to use your mannerisms. Like I used to watch Kelly Starrett mobility WOD videos back in the day, early Kelly Starrett, like when he started the mobility WOD project. And now it's called the Ready State. It's something completely different. But back then I would watch these videos and just binge watch these videos, but I would watch it all the way through with the sound on and just like listen to the information and try to get as much information as I could. And then, because I was learning at the time, I was like 21, 20 years old. I was learning about the power of motor neurons and like watching people, and mirror neurons and how you reflect what you see when you're in that position of teaching. So I'd watch the videos a second time through with the sound off and just try and like learn from the way that he used his body to explain what he was talking about. And I just got just dug so deep and just was so like feverishly curious about learning about this thing that just intrigued me. And I've seen that trend in my life. I mean, now it's kind of like that with golf now. It's oddly enough, elk hunting. I've been like that with archery. It's just been a handful of things that just like scratch that itch for me, that just provide me kind of a breeding ground to be passionate and curious about things. And I think that openness to experiences, openness to a diverse set of experiences in our lives actually gives us more free will. I think that curiosity leads to more free will. And when it comes to free will, I think there are more limits to our free will. If you're actually mindful of yourself, you'll notice that things kind of just happen, and you can't really say why you chose this versus that, right? You can justify it, but it's really hard to understand if you get down in there and like, how much free will do we actually have? And for me, I operate from the belief that you can't choose something that doesn't occur to you to be chosen. And when you dig into that, it's like, well, how does something occur to you to be chosen? Well, via experience, right? If you experience something, you have more context. With more context, you have more options. With more options, more things can occur to you to be chosen, which leads to more free will. And having freedom as a value, right? Not a principle for me necessarily, but for some it may be, as a value, I think free will is a huge part of that. And I feel like that is the product of a diverse set of experience driven by curiosity. Now, as we go on, I also think and believe that via curiosity, we can obtain something called like steel manning the other side. I was recently on a podcast called The Art of Masculinity with my buddy Johnny. Great dude. We had a great conversation, went way over. I think we did like an hour and 40 minutes. We had a great time and dug deep. We were talking about this and he was like, what can we do in this like environment of hyperpartisanship and anger and frustration? What can we do in this to keep our head on straight? Like not f this up, like not get caught up in all of it. And I'm like, if you can't make a case for your opposition, if you can't steel man what you're against and make an actual case, if you're a hardcore libertarian, if you can't make a case for socialism, right? A real one, because they have valid points, right? And then same thing, if you're a socialist or whatever it is, you can't make a case for libertarianism, right? And see the commonalities, look at the Venn diagram and see what issues you actually agree are problems, and maybe you have different solutions, but can you make a case for that? If you can't do that, well, then you're kind of, right? You don't really have a position. You have an ideology, you're entrenched, but you really don't have the opportunity to even make a valid choice if you can't really see the perspective of the other side. Now that's empathy in many ways, right? It's objectivity in many ways. And I think that also is driven by curiosity. And I think curiosity leads into other things, right? You can find stuff that you love by just trying new stuff and being open to that, not being so reactive. So if we can get ourselves in a state through curiosity that we're less reactive and more responsive, right? More mindful in the way we respond to things, that can be a very productive way of living life, right? And through that, we could add in what I call like productive friction, right? Because we want resistance in our lives, right? Resistance makes us grow, makes us stronger. It gives us something to achieve, If you're always walking downhill, that's not a very productive way to live, right? You're just kind of going with the flow. You don't have that tenacity, that real, like that grit. And I think that's super important, men, women, whatever, right? They, thems. We all need some kind of friction in our lives, but are we mindful and conscious in the way that we put the friction in our lives in a way that is productive for us? And I think to do that, again, you need to be curious about what's out there in the world, which brings us to the second principle of this show, which is resilience. And you'll notice that the reason these are principles and not values is because they manifest in different ways, right? Values can change, actions can change, but principles are a little bit less fluid in the way that they function, right? So resilience, what does that mean? Well, discipline, effort, structure, work capacity. And when I say work capacity, I mean, of course, physical work capacity, mental work capacity, spiritual work capacity, emotional work capacity. Like, where can you focus on your life to become more resilient? Also find things like being able to grow your own food or harvest your own food, right? Knowing how to fix things. If shit were to go down, if grocery stores didn't exist, how long could you survive, right? That's a valuable question for anybody to ask themselves, especially given our current climate, because you never know what can happen. How resilient are you in the face of some kind of adversity, right? And that may manifest itself different for different people, right? For me, that I think that the ability, like if there were no grocery stores, I wouldn't be that concerned, right? I've got stockpiles of food. I've got elk and deer, and we bought half a cow, so that's kind of hanging around. I've got dried foods, but also I've got access to animals, and I know what to do and how to handle that, right? That makes me a more resilient human being. Maybe that's growing food for you. Maybe that's having a quality water source and being able to filter water or collect rainwater, like things like that, right? I'm not talking about being a prepper necessarily, but just in case. Are you resilient? Are you physically strong and capable, right? Do you have that? Right? So it's working out, and that may mean a lot of things for different people. Again, that may mean going for a couple mile walk every day. That may mean trying to squat 600 pounds. But whatever that is for you, are you resilient in a way that is an alignment for who you are and who you want to be and how you want to show up in the world? And I think a lot of that also has to do with being connected to your humanity. So much of that resilience comes from being connected to your humanity and not disconnected. Because once you're disconnected from your own humanity, you can blow with the wind, right? Whatever the cultural winds are blowing, and you're just kind of out there flapping around. That doesn't really doesn't really create an environment of resilience within yourself. And again, I bring up that work capacity piece because to me, that's huge, right? Are you emotionally resilient? Are you physically resilient? Are you mentally resilient? It's something we can all work on. What are those internal resources that you have? Those internal, we have our resources outside. We have money and we have, whatever our property, whatever we have, right? We have those resources, our cars and whatever. But do you have the internal resources to become a more resilient human being? These are all things and all they're quality questions we can ask as we start to try and introduce productive friction into our lives. And the third principle that I find incredibly important, and you can see how on a Venn diagram these all kind of work together. But the third principle of this show, my personal third principle, and what we'll be working through in this podcast and the content we produce is passion, right? Passion. And when I say passion, I don't mean like love necessarily, but do you have things in your life where you are intrinsically motivated to show up for those things as the best version of yourself? And we can also, put a little fun in here, right? Because being passionate about things is fun. Challenging yourself is fun. For me, golf. I'm incredibly passionate about golf. I love golf, right? I want to show up on tee box number 1. I want to show up at the range an hour before I play as the best version of myself. I want my timing to be good. I want my mindset to be right. I may drink 1 or 2 beers at most. Like I'm not a drinker golfer. I go out there and I want to go low. I want to leave that being like, there were some wins today. There were some things to work on. I write that stuff down. I've got a journal in my golf bag. Like I take it seriously. But with that, it's like, well, yeah, golf is, if shit were to go down, there's nuclear war, like you're not thinking about golf. But because I want that mental resilience and I want to be passionate about something, like that's something that's me versus me, right? I'm also very passionate about elk hunting and backcountry hunting in general, but specifically elk hunting. But elk hunting, duck hunting, pronghorn, deer, all these kind of things. I love this stuff. Pig hunting, I love it. I'm very passionate about it, right? And I want to show up on September 2nd. I want to wake up in my sleeping bag or in my rooftop tent or wherever I'm at, or driving up at 3 o'clock in the morning to the mountains. I want to be in the woods on September 2nd, the first day, the opening day of archery elk season, as the best version of myself. That's how I define a passion. So do you have things in your life where you're driven to show up as the best version of yourself to that thing? Doesn't matter what it is. It can be paintball. It can be knitting. I don't give a fuck. It can be working out. A lot of people are very passionate about working out. I had to come to terms with the fact that somebody who worked in the fitness industry for 10 years and has been nothing but passionate about fitness most of my life, I'm not that passionate about fitness anymore. But I have a principle of resilience, and my passions require me to be in good physical condition. Therefore, I get my ass in the gym and I put in work and I do things I don't really want to do. Today, I was doing a bunch of structural work for my hips. I did not want to do that, but it creates longevity so I can pursue my passions and be a more resilient human being because I'm operating from a place of principle. So you can see how understanding this, you can cut out so much bullshit out of your life. And we can create, because human nature will point us towards incentives, right? We will move towards incentives. Trees move towards incentives. Animals move towards incentives. And we are animals. We move towards incentives, right? Plants will grow towards the sun if they need the sun. There's a reason that all trees don't grow straight. They grow towards where the most sun comes from. Go outside and walk around. Look at tree branches, right? They bend and turn based on when and how they grow. It's beautiful. And we don't operate any different way, right? We move towards incentives. So who is putting those incentives in your life? Who is putting the incentives in your life? Is it you? Is it some asshole on Instagram? Who's doing it? Is it productive for you? Or is it distracting? Is it stressful? Right? These are all important things that we need to confront and acknowledge to move forward. I also think that when in our passions, we do need some kind of quantifiability, right? Some kind of measurement for ourselves, whether it could be a feeling. This is why I think journaling is so important, because we get a chance to kind of quantify where we are in our life, how we feel, kind of these self-reports. We need these in our passions, right? For me in hunting, it's like, okay, are you hearing bugles? Cool. Are you seeing elk? Are you smelling elk? Are you finding wallows? Are you putting in the miles? Are you reevaluating the way you're doing things? Are you e-scouting? Do you have your cameras up? Are you checking your shit? Are you sleeping in? Like, these are all things I can look at and be like, I can self-assess. And with that, we get this in this flow state. We can also find like a sense of obsession in it. That's beautiful. That's like a beautiful part of life, is being so passionate about something that you go to sleep thinking about it. I'm also very passionate about being a father, right? Which is something that I knew would happen, but I'm still just like in awe of the way that I feel internally all the time. I'll randomly just start crying. It's, yeah, crazy. So if you operate, the show will operate through the principles of curiosity, resilience, and passion. And I hope that can do something in your life, right? If you maybe help you understand the way that I'm articulating this, help you understand like, hey, I should evaluate what my principles are. And then what values manifest out of those and what actions manifest out of those values. It's a fun game to play. And it's productive friction. It's the kind of resistance we need in our lives to check those boxes, to move through. So that's where we're going with this. In the conversations and the dialogue, even when we talk about culture and political things, we're going to do it through those principles. And since I have those defined now, I've got a measuring stick kind of for myself. And I'm stoked on it. And if that's not what you're here for, that's cool. I get it. No judgment. It's not, whatever. Do your thing. If it is what you're here for, yeah, let's roll. Let's get into it.